Well, good morning. As Vice Chair of the Public Accounts Committee, I would like to call to order today's meeting. We are dealing this morning in open session with the report of the Auditor General to the House of Assembly that was tabled or deemed tabled with the legislature today. I would like to welcome the Auditor General, and we'll start by having the members of the committee introduce themselves. Could we start with Mr. Ramey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Gary Ramey, MLA Lunenburg West.
Matt Wynot, Hammonds Plains, Upper Sackville.
Brian Skbar, member for Cumberland North.
Good morning, Clary McKinnon, MLA Pictou East.
Diana Whalen, MLA for Halifax Clayton Park.
Alan McMaster, MLA for Inverness.
Chuck Porter, MLA Hants West.
Thank you very much. And Mr. LaPointe, would you care to introduce your staff?
Certainly. I have, Mr. Chair, with me today, Alan Horgan, the Deputy Auditor General, Anne McDonald, the Assistant Auditor General, and in charge of financial audit, and Shelley Creighton, the Audit Principal for Financial Audit.
Thank you very much. We have already had an in-camera session with you that immediately preceded this, so to a certain extent, of course, we are briefed already on this report that we have just seen this morning. However, if you wish to make an introductory statement, I would invite you to do that now before we start questioning.
All right, well, thank you then, Mr. Chair. I will, very briefly, just mention again that I presented earlier this morning a copy of this January report to the Chief Clerk, and since the House is not in session today, the report is deemed to be tabled. It's being distributed to the members of the House now, and is also available now to the public. And as we mentioned earlier, this is not our usual report. We've provided you today with a new report that we hope to continue providing annually, if it suits you. It's a specialized report focused on financial issues, and it incorporates in one report all the work we do on financial auditing during the year. It includes a chapter that discusses our financial audits and reviews, particularly on the revenue estimates and the consolidated financial statements. A chapter provides the results of an audit we conducted on governance and control frameworks related to the Treasury function. We have chapters on financial indicators, particularly on sustainability, on our reviews of agency external audit opinions and management letters, and our follow-ups on our financial recommendations dating back to 2005. Now, I mentioned the staff that are with me today, with Anne and Shelley in particular, are responsible for the work presented in this report. And I'm sure that we'll be able to therefore answer any questions that you may have. Now, I realize that this is a short time for you to consider what questions you may want to ask us, and I understand too that the committee is planning to have a further session on this at some point in February, so that you'll have another opportunity to ask us as a department any questions that may come up in your further analysis of this in a few weeks coming. We're pleased to answer the committee's questions.
Thank you. That's a very high-level and general comment. Did you want to draw our attention to any particular aspects of the contents of the report before we move to the questioning?
Well, I would point out, I guess, that the aside from the chapters providing the details on the work we've done in the various audits and reviews during the year, the report includes responses from the department, and we have mentioned that we have some concerns with the responses we've received. But we have also included a chapter, an introductory chapter, in which I do make some introductory comments, and basically my commentary on my opinion on the status of long-term debt in this province. But I think I'll need to, I don't want to get into a lot of detail on the content of the report, I guess, and just leave it to whatever questions you may want to ask us about it.
thank you. I issued the invitation mostly because I was thinking about the audience watching at home, but we'll move to the questioning. So thank you. We'll move first to the Liberal caucus. The tradition of the committee is that each of the caucuses is initially afforded 20 minutes of questioning time. We'll start with the Liberal caucus. Ms. Whalen, for the first round of 20 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And I wanted to first off say thank you for the report this time, Mr. Lapointe, because I realize this is your first time of gathering all of the financial audits that you do into one audit for us. Usually it's a chapter attached to the back of one of your performance audits. And I know as members of the committee, we tend to gravitate our questions and our interests towards the departments and programs that you're auditing. And very often the financial information is you know, maybe not overlooked, but it certainly doesn't get the attention it deserves. So it's helpful to us to have it all here at one time. At the same time, many members of the committee are not nearly as well versed in finances. Of course, the auditors are. So some of it is a little, you know, I guess, not our usual area of expertise. I have got an accounting background, and I also find it hard to sometimes go through this, especially in the short period of time we have. But there were a couple of comments you'd made in the beginning session that we had in camera that certainly pointed out areas that we should be looking at. And the very first chapter talks about revenue estimates. And I guess it's chapter 2, the first one that was included in the discussion. So in looking at revenue estimates, what I took from that was that over the years, there's been a disagreement between the government finance department and the Auditor General's office about consolidating all of the revenue estimates when we get a budget for revenue for the year, so that it would be comparable to the actuals at the end of the year that we see in the public accounts. Is that correct?
Yes, I can ask Ms. McDonald to speak to that one.
Just to see that we're framing it correctly.
Yes, that's right. The revenue estimates are presented on an unconsolidated basis, and the financial statements are presented on a consolidated basis. At the end of the year, in preparation for the public accounts, there is a reconciliation in the public accounts document which goes from the revenue estimates and reconciles to ultimately the consolidated. So it takes, if you will, an unconsolidated position, it makes the adjustments to bring it to a consolidated position. What I guess our disagreement has been, and why we continue to recommend, is that the revenue estimates themselves can be prepared on a consolidated basis. And I guess to highlight, it's not just an area of disagreement, it's an area with respect to our opinion that it has to be qualified because they are not presented on a consolidated basis.
So in other words, every year when the auditor is asked to give an opinion on the estimates, you always have a qualification on that because you disagree that it's not complete. You claim it's not complete because it doesn't have everything consolidated?
It simply is not consolidated. So the opinion is qualified, and the other thing that we have to qualify for is not only are the revenues not in there on a consolidated basis, there's also no estimate made of them. So we can't even figure out whether the dollar amount of what's missing from those revenue estimates is significant to then be able to assess materiality.
Okay. Can you say really what the impact would be on this? Like, does it have a material, you don't know if it has a material impact on the province by not following the recommendation that the Auditor General's been making since, I think, 2001?
Well, I can tell you that in 2009, the government hired a consultant, Deloitte, to look at this issue. And in the course of preparing a report, that consultant listed third-party revenues. So these are numbers from the 2007-2008 financial statements of these entities. And for example, in this estimate or rather in these results for 07-08, regional school boards and the Nova Scotia Community College had revenues of $342 million. So they are significant revenues, not nearly as significant to the total as the revenue in the consolidated fund. However, the revenues of these entities do represent a significant balance.
No, absolutely. When you say that, it puts it in a different light because that's hundreds of millions.
Yes.
So that certainly is material in the circumstance of the province. What I wanted to ask you about specifically was around the petroleum royalties. You have a recommendation there asking for an independent review of their forecasts of royalties, and that would be, I guess, the income from our offshore petroleum activities. Can you give me a little bit more background on that, about what's missing and perhaps what the government's response was on it?
Sure. With respect to the petroleum royalties, the issue is that there's a model that's used to produce the royalties for the year, and that there are inputs to the model, inputs that come from economic assumptions. I know that the government gets information from the producers, and this information, these inputs go into the model, calculations are done, if you will, and then there's an output, which is ultimately the petroleum royalty. We recommended, because we had found some errors in the inputs, we recommended that there be an independent review. I think on hindsight, perhaps the word independent may not have been the best word to use. What we simply meant was that the Department of Finance find a second individual to take a look at the inputs to make sure that they were accurate, because again we found some errors, and to look at the output for reasonability.
Right. Could you indicate what kind of errors you found? Again, how material were those errors, and how did you find them?
The errors were not material. It's mostly a process situation. With many of our recommendations, because we're issuing an unqualified opinion on the financial statements of the province, we're not finding material errors as we go through. During the financial statement audit, when we looked at the inputs, there were some, an input was inaccurate. So the result is not significant. However, the process should be undertaken to review those inputs.
Okay. And I understand you're saying it just should be somebody outside of government that has a look at it, maybe just another opinion. You said it's not necessarily an expert opinion.
Well, no, actually, it doesn't even have to be somebody outside of government. It's just somebody, another staff member, can look at it. So the word independent, perhaps, again, was not the right choice, but I think it's a fairly simple process.
The reason I gravitated to that recommendation was also because this year the Auditor General's office made an attempt to do an audit of the offshore petroleum, Nova Scotia, Canada Offshore Petroleum Board, is that right? And in doing that, there had been a question about proprietary information, and the answer from, and in fact, you weren't able to do it because of lack of information. So going back to the government's answer for recommendation 2.3, they again talk about it includes proprietary information. So that's why they say, the government's saying they wouldn't go for an independent review because it's, I guess, secret information from the companies. Is there an overlap on those two issues?
Yes, I can answer that. The issue of proprietary information here is not relevant. As Anne stated, we're saying that someone else, the information is prepared by people in the department. We're saying that someone else who's not one of the preparers looks at it. It's just checks and balances. Okay. So that we need someone who didn't prepare the numbers to look at the numbers and to see that they're reasonable. So we're not talking about taking proprietary information and giving it to an outsider at all. We're saying keep it within government.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I understand. So that really means their answer, could be amended if they understood that you didn't want it to go outside to somebody who wasn't within I guess, would keep it confidential within government. That's right. Yes. Okay, that makes some sense. What kind of materiality is there in the revenue we get now from petroleum? Can you give us a rough idea how much revenue is coming in from petroleum? I know it was going down over the last number of years, but maybe while she does that, Mr. Lapointe, I'll ask you a couple of questions because time is flying. In your first chapter in this report, it was quite unusual, actually, that you did, I guess, offer some personal opinion on the financial health of the province and some of your concerns. It doesn't have any recommendations. It's more of a discussion around long-term debt. And I'm wondering if you could just explain why you put that chapter in. I don't think we've seen it in any other reports.
No, that's correct. I'll be glad to speak to that. My concern with the debt of the province stems from initially just seeing what is happening in the financial crisis that we've been experiencing in Canada and in fact across the world. The crises primarily seem to go back to problems of household debt, as we've seen in the States with the mortgage problems, and government debt. There are other issues involved. You know, people talk about the impact of spikes in oil prices and so on and how that affects the economy. But primarily what we're seeing today is a crisis of government debt. And then when you stop to think about, well, how did we get to this point when governments like Greece are potentially talking about going bankrupt? How is this even possible? This is a Western world, and these are advanced economies. The concern I have with the way we spend in this country and in this province is really the issue, is that we have a conventional wisdom that has evolved over the decades, that government is allowed, in fact, to spend money it doesn't have, to use borrowing as a way of paying for current expenditures, to use borrowing as a way of paying for big capital expenditures. I'm questioning all of that. I'm saying now that we have to consider that if you continue to spend beyond your means, your debt continues to increase, at a certain point, you can't sustain that anymore. Yeah. It's just common sense, in fact. So there's a financial issue involved, of financial responsibility of governments over in Nova Scotia, going over decades, of continually adding to the debt, with the focus usually being on whether we have deficits or surpluses and are they manageable or not. I'm saying that our focus is on the wrong issue. Our focus should be on whether we're adding to the debt or not. So are we borrowing to spend? If so, we are saying that we will spend the money today, and we here today, all of us, will derive the benefits from that government spending. But the people who will ultimately have to pay for that spending are those who will, one, pay the interest on the borrowing in the future, and two, will someday presumably have to pay it back. And it won't be us. Mm-hmm. It will be our children. And it won't be any of us in government, because we'll be long gone. Who will be accountable for paying this back? It'll be other people. It won't be us. That goes beyond questions of sustainability of spending, and goes beyond questions of fiscal responsibility to me. I think that not only, we have to consider anyway whether it's fiscally responsible to act that way, and I personally believe that it no longer is. Whether it ever was 30 years ago, it is not today.
Right. Beyond
that, I believe that it comes down to a re-examination of our beliefs of what is appropriate for government spending. And I think we need to ask the question of whether it is at all ethical for us as citizens to ask the government to spend on our behalf, but not ask us to pay for it, to defer the spending through debt and ask our children to pay for what we receive today in medical care, health care, or anything else. The other ethical question is whether it's simply right for governments to borrow and to defer and not incur accountability for the money required to pay for that, for the spending, rather than spend out of current money and to live within our means, to simply defer raising the revenue for that spending to the future, when other governments will have to presumably raise taxes to pay that debt back. In fact, I think we defer. If you look at what happens, we do not pay back. We defer almost on a permanent basis. We cause ourselves difficulties as well with the very fact that we have to pay interest on that debt. So I mentioned that our statistics here show that with net debt of of almost $13 billion. Gross debt is closer to $16 billion. That means that every man, woman, and child in this province is indebted to the tune of over $15,000. If you're a family of four, what does it mean? And it's not a fictional number. It's a true number. There's less than 1 million of us, and we have $16 billion in debt.
Can I ask you just where the
$861
trend
million
is?
in interest as well on that. Sorry, I'm going on too long.
Yeah. No, I did want to, I've got your philosophy on it now, that's for sure. And I agree, we carry a high level of debt in this province. We're probably the first or second most indebted province in the country on a per capita basis.
That's correct.
And you make the point in your report that it's certainly growing faster than our population. So that means the impact or the weight on each person in Nova Scotia grows. On the per capita, I think you gave the figure of 13,841 per person in 2010. So that's on a per person basis.
Yeah.
What measures, and you give quite a few measures in here, so I think for the few minutes I have left, I'll just look at the debt. You've got a number of measures about debt as a percentage of provincial revenue or debt as a percentage of our GDP, which shows our ability to pay it down or to look after it. Which one do you think is most critical for the province in terms of looking at our overall health?
It's hard to say which one particular statistic might be the most critical. They all measure different forms of sustainability. I think the net debt per capita is certainly a critical one because that brings it down to per person, comparing by province, how are we doing? And it also makes it very real as to what each individual in the province actually owes and actually, for instance, is paying in interest.
In most of the measures that I see here, and the trend seems to be rising, without a doubt. The debt is rising. It's rising on a per-person basis. It's rising as a percentage of our gross domestic product. The only thing going down a little bit was the interest rate, and I think it's because we've been having very favorable low interest rates in the country. So you probably internationally as well. So our annual cost is down a bit, but it's still close to $1 billion. Isn't that right?
Yeah, 861 million at the current time.
So overall, I guess in your focusing on sustainability, you wanted to point out the fact that the trend is getting less sustainable?
Yes, as long as it's less sustainable as long as you're adding to the debt. You can only be either reducing or increasing the amount that you owe. And if we had a period in which we did reduce the debt in this province, unlike most other provinces. We have had that period of time, but it was a very short period of time. We are now back to basically the same trend that we've had for a very long time of continually, gradually adding to it. Now, it doesn't necessarily provide worse statistics in relation, say, to the economy and so on, because the economy continues to grow. But what can fool you into thinking that you're okay is if your debt increases, but it looks all right because in comparison to GDP or in comparison to other provinces and so on, it looks like it's remaining relatively stable so that you're apparently in good shape. I think those kinds of statistics can be deceptive. We've been fairly stable in terms of our debt for some time. And certainly, as you noticed, our interest has been, in fact, decreasing for various reasons. But the fact remains that as long as you're adding to the debt, you are gradually, over time, deferring more and more spending and gradually putting yourself into more and more at risk.
At the current rate that we're paying on interest, and even with the very favorable interest rates we've been able to everybody's been able to get access to, what percentage of our revenue is going towards just paying down interest every year? Or just paying interest, we're not paying down debt?
The interest on the interest as a percentage is roughly about, I believe, 9%.
9% of all of our revenue going just to service our debt.
So 9 cents out of every dollar of taxes, if you want to put it that way, taxes and the revenues, goes to paying interest on spending that occurred in the past and is not available for other programs today.
And in the last 2 years, have we added to our net debt on any of these measures, gross debt, net debt?
We've added, according to the statistics, we're adding about $1 billion a year to gross debt, to the long-term debt. The net debt is a more complicated figure and includes, deferred revenue, accounts payable, accounts receivable, and cash, and accumulated deficits. So it appears to be more stable. But nevertheless, we keep adding to our borrowing every year.
So the trend is definitely what you see as a major risk for our province when you look at sustainability and the future of Nova Scotia.
I do, and I'm taking a long-term view of this. I'm not looking at what happened this year or last year. I'm saying that over the decades, we've accumulated a debt which, to my mind, is very hard to imagine how we can pay off, and which is costing us $861 million a year just for interest. And we are at a very low interest period. I remember 18% interest in my life.
Well, that's the risk I see coming too.
I don't know what would happen if interest rates doubled or tripled, which they will at some point do.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. We've actually used up the first 20 minutes available for the Liberal caucus. We'll move now to the PC caucus for a round of 20 minutes. And Mr. Porter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank Mr. Lapointe and your committee for the very detailed report and comments that we've had a chance to go back and forth with this morning so far. A lot of work has gone into this, and I look forward to future data, as I said earlier as well, coming back and having had the time to go through it in more detail and ask questions certainly worthy of the work that's gone into it. So I'll start on the long-term debt. You've been speaking throughout the last 20 minutes a lot on this whole piece around the debt, the potential ethics around that, and our spending methods over previous years. Can you talk a little bit about, as we did earlier, the growth annually in the debt? We've seen I asked a question about the it looked to me as a $1.3 billion in debt over the last 2.5 years or so. You clarified that a little better, so I would ask maybe now that we're in public domain if we could just have that discussion again.
Yes, I can ask Ms. McDonald to speak a little bit more detail on this, but I can say that the statistics are that looking back over the last several years, that we did have a short period in which we were able in Nova Scotia to actually I guess, fight the general trend in the country and pay down some of our debt. But we've been, since I guess the onslaught of this financial crisis and the recession, have begun again to add to our borrowings. And the last few years, it seems to be, depending on what figure you look at, but if you look at the long-term debentures of the province, it's about $1 billion a year that we're currently adding to the long-term debt. The net debt is, as I say, a more complex figure. Did you want to add something? We'll pass to Anne to.
Thank you. The exhibits in Chapter 4 outline the trend, and you are right that between 2010 and 2011, the long-term debt has increased by $1.1 billion, and the net debt of the province has increased by has actually decreased by about $200 million. But again, net debt is an all-encompassing number. Long-term debt is what is owed to creditors.
And the projected long-term debt in that table you have here shows a slight upward, if I'm looking at that correctly, continues to grow, not decline in the next, well, through 2015, if that's accurate on the chart. The number's small there for me to read, but I think that's what it says.
That's right. The information for the projections comes from the budget for 2011-12. The net debt is included with the budget forecast for the next several years. The net long-term debt is derived from a table which shows financial market debt projected over the next few years.
Thank you. And I'm just going to bounce around a quick bit, and then I'm going to pass it over to Mr. McMaster as well, who's got more questions. I just want to bounce around to district health authorities as listed in section page 69, just for the clarity. That top paragraph talks about The Cape Breton District Health Authority felt it was important to bring attention to the board that there was a significant amount of overtime being paid to individuals, and in a couple of circumstances, employees were paid overtime equal to their regular salaries. These two are among 35 who were paid overtime in excess of $25,000. Is this a trend that we see through, although they're not detailed out here, are those trends that we saw through the various health authorities, or was this specific to the Cape Breton District Health Authority?
So I'll ask Ms. McDonald to answer that question.
Thank you. Again, this chapter provides the results of our review of auditors' management letters and opinions. And so the Cape Breton District Health Authority was the only health authority that had been, this situation had been noted. So I don't have information on whether overtime is an issue in other health authorities.
Okay, so those weren't assessed specifically, those were offered to you by way of those management letters, and that's just what came forward from the authority?
Yes, and also just to point out that the auditors indicated in the letter, as we have done here, that it was a matter they wanted to bring to the board's attention. They didn't indicate whether there was any issue with that overtime.
Great. Thank you for that. And I just want to touch on one other thing before I hand it over, and that was the estimating going ahead, and we talked about that a little bit earlier. If you want to clarify some of that by way of your language, I think was not labor intensive. It could be easily done, and the importance of those projections and how the numbers, I think Mr. Lapointe also stated in those comments that they were fairly stable going in past years, so looking ahead, they would be fairly easy to predict. And I think my question was around how simple is that to do, and where does that labor come from that does that and puts this into place? How do you see that?
Ms. McDonald?
Thank you. Again, I think the first year that this was undertaken would be more labor intensive, as anything is at the start. I just want to highlight again, though, that the concept of a schedule that has the revenue estimates included on it completely is one that the government hired consultant proposed back in 2009. And so I guess ultimately it's not our idea, but we certainly suggest that that schedule is a reasonable approach to resolving this matter.
Thanks very much. I'm going to pass the rest of my time over to Mr. McMaster.
Thank you, Mr. Porter. And Mr. McMaster, your turn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here today. This is a very important topic and that we're discussing. I had asked a question earlier, and I'd like to ask it again just to put it on the record here. And I know you've commented a bit already, but it was on page 2 of the summary report where you referenced the fact that the government's practice of borrowing to pay for current expenditures raises ethical questions in that, is it right for Nova Scotians to expect and receive government services as a group that they as a group do not completely pay for, deferring part of the payment to future generations? Could you just put that on the record, what we had spoke about before?
Yes, glad to speak to that one. I guess the question that I'm raising in the chapter on the introductory chapter includes commentaries that I'm making, which are my personal views, I must add, on this, derived from my last few years of looking at the activities of government and being closely involved with the finances of government. But when I see the current situation, I find myself thinking that it is beyond just numbers, and what we have to look at with our approach to government spending is whether we have to reconsider what we think is appropriate and what we think is not. Given our view of what has happened in government spending over the last few decades here and elsewhere, I now look at the approach to funding government spending by borrowing, not just for current activities but capital activities, and I believe that we have to, even as parts of government, but also even as citizens of the province, ask again whether this is an ethical question and whether it is actually ethical for us as residents of this province to ask the government to spend money on us for programs that benefit us, but that we do not necessarily pay for, or not fully pay for, to defer the spending to the future, in which case we're not paying for what we receive, but we're deferring to let our children pay for it. And beyond that, the individual question as forming part of the government of this province, we have to consider whether it is right for government to behave in a way that includes spending for current benefits without incurring the sacrifice of raising funds to pay for that spending now, to defer the payment to the future, not necessarily even to our children, but if you look at the history, we have deferred permanently. And what gets paid in the future is not even a repayment of the debt to pay for that spending, but paying on an ongoing cost annually the interest to sustain the past spending. So we are paying, for instance, today, $861 million this year to pay for spending that occurred to benefit people in the past. Well, my feeling is that this is an ethical question, not a financial question. My personal belief is that it's not ethical to do this. My personal belief is that it's wrong. Now, you may feel differently, but I guess what I'm saying is that we all have to ask ourselves that question and reconsider again what is right and what is wrong for government to do in terms of how it finances what it spends.
And just keeping on that topic, considering that we haven't been facing any wars, I mean, you'd mentioned that any wars or natural disasters you had commented on, you know, maybe instances where governments can look at deficit spending, but considering we weren't facing that back in 2009, and considering that also in some of your past reports, you indicated that right up until 2009, there had been 8 balanced budgets. But recognizing that there was an amount for universities left out of the 2009 budget, could not the government back in 2009 made a choice with modest cost control to bring the budget back into balance almost immediately, certainly within a year, instead of now being on the track we're on, which we're not going to be balanced until 2014?
I guess to answer that question, I'd have to say that my commentary is taking a very long-term view. I mentioned that where we are today is a result of several decades of spending decisions by a lot of different governments. And I'm concerned about what happens in the long term. So I'm not particularly commenting on, on government policy, certainly, or on this particular government or prior or predecessor governments. The other thing that I'm trying to get away from in terms of focus with the issue of debt is that I'm thinking that we have for a very long time in I guess political discourse focused on government being in balance, government being in surplus or deficit, having balanced budgets. And I'm saying that can be deceptive if that's your focus, because you can certainly have a balanced budget and be adding to the debt through capital budgets. And the issue of being in balance is not sufficient. If you incur debt, you're going to have to, if you want to pay it back someday, you're going to have to incur very large surpluses to accumulate money to pay off the debt. So the focus on balancing budgets or surplus or deficit, it's okay, but I'm saying that let us refocus as well, not necessarily look at that, but look at whether you're simply adding to or decreasing the amount of long-term debt that you have. And my belief is that you need to look at that first and consider the ethical question, not around balanced budgets, but around long-term debt.
I think that's an excellent point. But I also know you mentioned about that it's unfortunate when governments run operating deficits because they're adding debt to the books that's really of no future value, and that there's no asset that's owned by the province, like a road or a bridge or a hospital. Has it been ethical for this government to be adding operating deficits the past number of years?
Well, I seriously don't think it'd be appropriate for me to be commenting on the ethical right or wrong of any particular, government decision.
I can appreciate that.
I'm looking at the general concept that we have to consider. And any particular situation can actually be fairly complicated. You can be, in fact, a government can be running a surplus in its spending and apparently be doing fine at the same time, adding $500 million to debt through capital spending. And there are times in which that can be appropriate. I mentioned there, as a general rule, I believe we need to live within our means. But on the other hand, you can have emergencies. What happens if you have a hurricane or a crisis? You can have a large project that you have to undertake for the long-term good, and it's just simply too large to be able to afford if you have to have the money for it today. And you can have, as we're experiencing now, in effect, a short-term economic downturn in which there is no choice. If you maintain government spending at a certain level, because that is your commitments, if your revenue drops, you will find yourself in a deficit situation. The question then becomes, what happens when you get out of it again? Is it sufficient then to say that you've balanced the budget? I'm saying that it may not be if in that period of time you incurred debt to finance those deficits. Then in straight Keynesian economics, you should be looking at running surpluses to pay off what you just incurred.
If we look at royalties, and I noted on page 57 of the main report, if you look at Newfoundland and Saskatchewan provinces which is nice that you compare us to other provinces, yes, whether by population or geography that we're close to. But if you look at Newfoundland and Saskatchewan, they have natural resources, which I think you'll see is the reason what's bringing down their debt. We don't have anywhere near the royalty potential. No. That they have. Would you consider it irresponsible of this government to be making decisions to run deficits when we don't have that kind of opportunity in our future, certainly not to the degree that they have, to help pay for those cost overruns today?
Well, now you're asking me to comment on the ethics of particular government's decisions.
Right. Maybe I should rephrase
that's
that.
Really not
if you were to look at, let's take it away from Nova Scotia, yes, and if you just spoke about a government in general who doesn't have the kind of future potential to earn those kinds of royalties to pay down debt, so there's no real future plan to be able to pay it down, is it not irresponsible for governments, unless it's a time of real extenuating circumstances, to be running deficit budgets, especially in an economy in Nova Scotia that's very defensive? We're not cyclical.
I guess I have to say that I have used the term fiscal responsibility in a report. And my belief is that as a general rule, living outside your means and borrowing money is fiscally irresponsible. But you have to consider whether you're into one of the exceptions that I mentioned. There are times when really it is the right decision. If it is right for a government to borrow money for a particular spending, let's say it is a disaster or it is an economic downturn in which you need to maintain your spending regardless. What you have to do then to be fiscally responsible is once you get out of that situation, you have to then consider if you've incurred X many millions of dollars of debt to get you through that period of time, over what period of time do you plan to pay it off? And you should have a plan to pay off debt. It may be, you may get to the point where you can't figure out a plan to pay off debt if you get in too deep. If you accumulate such an amount of debt that you don't see your way out, but you still at least have to consider some way to do that. Some provinces have been, in fact, very lucky to come into, in effect, large sources of funding through natural resources. That doesn't necessarily mean that they pay off debt with it. If you look at Saskatchewan, for instance, I think they could be out of debt today. They're not. Why is that? Is it more difficult here in Nova Scotia because we don't have those large sums?
Okay. If we look back to the Atlantic Accord, and I think you had kind of referenced this in some of the reading here, there was $830 million that came to the province from the federal government for offshore royalties that had been really accrued over years but hadn't arrived to us yet. And at that time, Dr. Ham was premier, and that was negotiated for the benefit of the province. And he did what I thought was something very responsible at the time. He put that money on the debt. looking at the financial position of the province today, has that benefit essentially been lost to the province in that since we've added to our debt and in the last couple of years, and we've essentially lost the benefit of that prudent decision?
Well, it's hard to say. It's how you look at it. The fact is that, yes, additional revenues came into the province, and they were, in fact, used to pay off debt, which from the point of view of what I've been saying is commendable. But then what has happened since can perhaps be seen as quite a distinct or quite separate situation, in that we then become embroiled in what is in effect a global financial crisis. So government has to make decisions on how to deal with that. The impact of that is that we have added to our debt, but I certainly hesitate to link the two things. We're into a situation in which government has decided it needs to borrow in order to just to maintain its services, and in fact to deal with a crisis. I can't make judgments on that, but my comment on that is that once we get out of this situation, the rule should be that once you incur debt, you need to consider over what period of time do you intend to pay it back.
Thank you, Mr. Lapointe. And Mr. McMaster's time is elapsed. I'm going to turn the floor over to Mr. Epstein for the NDP Caucus for 20 minutes.
Mr. Lapointe, I would like to tell you a story. It is set long ago and far away as Ottawa, and as long ago as almost 40 years ago, when I, as a very young lawyer in my very first job, was working for the Federal Department of Justice. I was assigned to a particular branch of the Department of Justice, and I was asked by my boss to prepare a memorandum that had to do with certain aspects of incarceration of individuals in the federal penitentiary system. I took this assignment away, and I produced for my supervisor, who was a very experienced lawyer, a document in which I discussed a philosophy of incarceration and questions of the treatment of prisoners in certain circumstances. My boss, the late Jack Hollies, invited me into his office, and he waved the memo at me, and he said, "Very interesting, but who asked you?" Now, this is a relevant point with respect to the report that you've given us. As you pointed out a couple of times, what you've treated us to is your personal views on government debt. Now, you're not a young professional wet behind the ears on your first assignment. And the question becomes whether it's appropriate in any way to have used the opportunity of being the Auditor General and being mandated to give a report that surveys the accounting practices of a province, to have strayed into what is fairly clearly a matter of general economics and of public policy that seems to go well beyond the remit of what it is that we expect from our auditor. The worry I have is that given the language that you've chosen to use, having once chosen to embark upon this discussion, has the potential to scare the population of Nova Scotia unjustifiably. And that concern flows from your concentration particularly on the sovereign debt crisis, which is a real problem in Europe. The repeated focus on this tends to suggest that Nova Scotia cannot manage its debt. And I want to take this opportunity to assure all Nova Scotians that our province is not about to go bankrupt. We are simply not in that condition. And I feel it necessary to make such a pure and bold and pure statement along these lines, given the way in which you have chosen to set out your personal views in this document. And I have to say to you that I find it highly problematic, not just that you've embarked upon this discussion, but the way in which you have done it. I have found it not to be balanced, not to be sufficiently detailed, and not sufficiently researched if, in fact, you wish to embark on this kind of discussion. And I want to lay out for you what I find to be problematic, so that if, in fact, as you suggested, this is the first of similar documents that are going to be presented to us, that I would invite you to think about the comments that I'm about to make, and I hope they do inform any future document or part of a document that makes an excursion into the general political life of the province, and particularly deals with economics questions that seem to go somewhat beyond the remit of someone who is dealing with accounting and audit functions. Let me start first with the language of ethics that was apparently central to how it is that you characterized what is the problem with debt. Unethical is a highly problematic term. It's certainly true that in analysis of debt or analysis of environmental issues, there is a concept of intergenerational equity in which one is invited to be aware of the implications of what we do today on future generations. No one doubts that. But whether we're actually dealing with a situation that could be characterized in any way as unethical is in fact a serious judgment call that I think is beyond what it is that we should have been offered. There are other words that are much closer to things like an audit function that might have been used. And on the positive side, for example, the words conventional or unavoidable or precedented could also have been used. If one wishes, if you wish to stick with the issue of something critical, you might have said something like, it is imprudent. You might have said, it might have been incautious. You might have suggested, if in fact you could show that it's out of line with what goes on in other provinces or the federal government. But the analysis that might lead to any of those words seems to me to be exactly absent from this document, and I suggest to you that the evidence is not there either. Let me move to the next point, which is an example of how it is that I find this document to be inadequate in its explanation of the historical context within which we find ourselves. What is glaringly omitted, just to start, is the recognition that this government, in fact, is engaged in a back-to-balance exercise in which it is dedicated and has laid out a plan to getting the governments of the province of Nova Scotia to eliminate its deficit and to have a balanced budget by the beginning of the fiscal year in 2013. That's exactly what this government is engaged in doing. This is exactly what the Back to Balance tour conducted by the Minister of Finance a couple of years ago was all about. It generated a plan. That plan has been adhered to. We're moving in the direction of getting the government to eliminate deficits. No mention of that in the report at all. None at all. So what seems to be missing is a recognition that what you're sounding the alarm over in fact, is being engaged with in a very painful and I would say difficult way by this government. I'm a longtime member of the legislature. I spent many years in opposition, and I was not thrilled to find myself and my party in government at a time when we were forced to both raise taxes and cut services in order to bring the budget back into balance. But that was the situation in which we found ourselves, and that is the situation with which we are grappling and have been grappling for the last 2.5 years and will continue to grapple until the beginning of the 2013 fiscal year, when the plan to get back to balance will have been accomplished. That's the plan. It's present. It's being acted on, and it wasn't mentioned even remotely in this document. Let me turn to another problem I have with your document, and it has to do with your analysis of the source of the so-called worldwide financial crisis. And what I suggest to you is that your analysis of the causes of the worldwide financial crisis is not only inadequate, it's probably basically wrong. And here's what you say. You say much of the world has been immersed in an economic and financial crisis, the roots of which may be said to lie primarily in excessive household and public sector debt. Well, you know, many people would not agree with that. Many people would, in fact, remind themselves that the so-called world economic crisis is not one that has really brought Canada to its knees, although we've certainly suffered through part of a recession, but we've done very well. And we've gotten through a lot of it quite well, and many of us, when we think about how it is that the world got into the fragile economic state in which it finds itself, would note with interest all the analyses that have been done that have suggested that it was a combination of inadequate regulation of US banks and financial houses, and in fact, in some circumstances, outright deregulation, and in that I have in mind some amendments to the Glass-Steagall Act that the US Congress put in place, leaving things like credit default swaps that are essentially an unregulated financial instrument, combined with outright instances of fraud and greed. Those seem to be the major factors that have actually led to the world financial crisis. Not the accumulation of household debt, not the accumulation of government debt, which are problematic, but are not really the causes, I think most analysts would say, of the nature of the financial crisis that we have. So if you're going to stray into questions of economics much more than questions of accounting, I have to ask myself why it is that we're not getting the kind of comprehensive analysis that might be useful. Now, it's true that the provincial government doesn't have control over banking. Banking, under our Constitution, is a federal matter. But if you're wanting to identify issues that, and educate the public about issues that are problematic, it's fine if you mention debt, but it's not, I think most commentators have agreed, the main cause of our international financial crisis.
Mr. Epstein, if I could interrupt you for a moment. More than 10 minutes of your time has elapsed, and we certainly have heard a number of your opinions and strong opinions. I'm wondering if you have questions so that the auditor has an opportunity to respond.
20 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
So you're having no questions?
I have no questions for the auditor except an invitation to him to think carefully about the points I'm making, and I'm now going to continue.
Thank you. That's good for the other members of the committee to understand. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, what I was touching on is what I regarded as being highly problematic in this document and its dealing with debt. I mentioned the historical context, and I mentioned that there was a failure to set out that the current government is engaged in a process of bringing our budget back into balance, in which we are now 2.5 years into it. But further on the question of historical context, what is not present is the underpinnings of setting out exactly how it is that the province of Nova Scotia got into the difficulties that we now have with respect to debt, how we even accumulated the debt. I'm not disagreeing with you that debt is something on the public policy agenda to be tackled, but it's only one of many topics to be tackled, and it's only one of many budget and fiscal topics to be tackled, and there are a variety of different ways of doing it. I would have thought that if you were going to focus so heavily on debt, you would have laid out the historical context. Now, early on in my time as a member of the legislature, I was the opposition critic for finance, and I went back and I looked at every year's budget, and I pulled out of it, starting in 1974, and went through every year up to 1998, and then I've continued to do this for all the years since then, the statements about provincial debt. And what emerged from my examination of that is that around the early 1970s, the province of Nova Scotia had trifling amounts of debt, maybe $500 million. But what has happened every year since then is that the debt has been added to, and indeed the real heavy, notoriously heavy spending years were through the 1980s and 1990s, in which successive governments, and since essentially your report now puts us in the middle of a highly political process, I have to point out successive Tory, especially Tory governments, followed by some Liberal governments, accumulated our debt. The Tories accumulated debt at a rate of about 3 to 1 over the Liberals during that time. And year in, year out, they overspent their revenues by about $300 or $400 million. And that was, some of it had to do with support for Cisco, but most of it had to do with simple overspending that did not match revenues year to year. I agree with you that this is not something that can go on forever. Of course it can't go on forever, and that's why we're trying to get it under control. But what I would have looked for in this kind of document that focuses so strongly on debt would be a longitudinal backing up with statistics of what actually happened over time. And I would have thought you might have been sensitive to the fact that these kinds of, as you say, personal view comments that come forward are exactly the kind of comments that could be used for political purposes aimed at the present government. And being aware of that, I would have thought you would have liked to have gone back and included in this kind of report the historical evidence of exactly where the debt came from and what it is that the money was used for if you wanted to push that far. And speaking of how the money is being used, if we take your criteria, that is, think about your criteria in which you suggest that there are times in which overspending is appropriate, then let's consider whether, in fact, any of these particular circumstances are being met. Well, top of the list, since I understand you to have advocated some form of Keynesian economics approach in which overspending is appropriate in times of recession or crisis in order to stimulate the economy, then we have to ask ourselves whether, in fact, we are in such a position. And indeed, it looks as if we are. We are not in such a crisis as the Europeans, but nonetheless, we are and have been since 2008, maybe as early as late 2007, in a situation in which we are either grappling with recession or trying to avoid recession. And I think all economists and all responsible ministers have acknowledged that. It's common currency in the language of economics. Indeed, the federal finance minister, Mr. Flaherty, when he recently announced that the federal government won't be able to get itself back into balance in the time frame that they had originally announced, and decided that they had to put it forward an extra year, which will put it at least 2 or 3 years behind the province of Nova Scotia, justified this action by saying that there are still some fragilities in the economic state of Canada, and therefore he felt it was justified to take a longer term to get back to balance. In other words, he felt that the stimulus was still necessary in order to promote the economy. And indeed, that's one of the things that this government has been doing. If you look at the capital plan that we put forward, we are interested in trying to spend on capital projects in order to stimulate the economy. And this is a responsible thing and actually happens to meet the criteria that you've set out in your report, but which is not commented on in the report. That is, it's not commented on that the government is actually engaged in doing exactly what it is that you're suggesting was necessary. And if you have a problem with the capital spending of this government, which is most recently announced in its capital budget, if you have a problem with this capital spending, it might be useful if you explained what's problematic about it. Is there something about a particular school or road or hospital renovation project that you think should be taken off the list of capital spending? But I don't hear that. I don't hear anything coming to grips with this issue. Another point that arises in your report that I find highly problematic is the interest rate scare. There is a suggestion made by you that the level of debt that the province has may be unsustainable because interest rates could go up. Well, you know, in the abstract, of course, that's a perfectly good point. But we live in the real world where we have to look ahead at the next year or two. And here's what's actually going on with interest rates. Interest rates are very low, and furthermore, one of the consequences of the international economic crisis that you point us to is that European debt has been downgraded. European debt has been downgraded, and now we encounter that investment phenomenon known as the flight to quality. The flight to quality, I hope this is a term you're familiar with, is when investors, people who buy stocks or bonds, invest in the best they can find. Canada has AAA rating. And it's going to be even more attractive for bondholders to invest in Canada, and it means we can command lower interest rates.
That's exactly 11:06. Thank you very much for your comments. I'm sorry to see there were no questions. If you would, Mr. Epstein, I'd like to change places with you for the next round of questioning. I've allotted 15 minutes, if that is necessary, for the members of the committee.
Second round, Ms. Whalen. It's now 11:06. I think, did you say 15 minutes?
15 minutes will take us to, I think, 11:51. So thank you very much. Mr. Lapointe, we've just had 20 minutes of a bit of a diatribe from the government members or member of the committee. It's unprecedented. I will use that word. It was certainly a vigorous defense of the government and the government's position, and that is what the members of the committee are here for, I guess, if they are representing the government. But at the same time, I appreciate that your role here is as a member, an independent advisor, an independent person who is a servant of the legislature. And I would like to offer you some time now to respond, if you would like to the last 20 minutes that we've just heard. I believe that, you know, it's respectful to give you the opportunity to speak on this issue. So if you would like to, I would like to share my time with you.
Well, thank you. But I would respond only briefly to what I heard, and that is, one, I'm certainly pleased that the way my commentary has stimulated comment and dialogue, and if it stimulates dialogue, then that's my intent. I'm very glad to see that. Clearly, the honourable member and I have some differing views, and I appreciate the advice as to how I should have written my report. However, I stand by my report, and I stand by the things I said. I believe that I'm operating, in fact, within my rights as an Auditor General to report to the House anything that I feel should be reported to the House. And in this case, it's some thoughts on long-term debt and our approaches to it. I stand by the things I've written about the use of the word ethics, and I believe that these are ethical questions, but that's fine. Again, I'm just presenting my viewpoint on these issues. I'm presenting them to the House, as I've said in the report, really in the interest of my concern for the well-being of the province and what's in the best interest of the people. However, I am certainly pleased to see that the comments in the introductory chapter generating some interest.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your comments on that, too. I think it's just a very unusual situation to have a member of the legislature lecturing, really, our Auditor General about the contents of the report. I think in raising the issue of debt, what you're really trying to do is to bring it to the attention of all members of the legislature. This is not a new situation, as the member from Shabakto has said. It's been existing for many years, and as the finance critic for the Liberal Party, when I first was appointed in 2003 in that role, I also looked at the debt and realized that in a period of low interest rates, we are able to sustain this and not cut our services. But should that change, and again, my first mortgage was at 14% for a home. I know mortgage rates and interest rates will rise. It is a risk, and your job is to point out to us risks that exist. I would ask under the debt question just now if you see any evidence of a debt management plan for the government. I don't know if you looked at that in measuring debt, but that would be how is the government responding? Is there a debt management plan that you know of? And if not, we'll ask the government member, the people from finance when they come later.
Yeah, I would say this is not something that was part of any of the audits that we did, so I wouldn't really have a comment on that.
Okay, it's it'd be something that we can raise. As you mentioned in your opening comments, we will be scheduling a time for representatives from the Department of Finance to come and discuss with us their response to the report. I'd like to ask a few more questions directly about the government reporting section of the report. I think that was Chapter 2, the results of the financial audits and reviews. And I wonder if you could characterize your reaction to the response from government. There's quite a long response at the end of the chapter, and it was indicated in the beginning on page 11 that you've published it verbatim. Everything that the Department of Finance responded is included in that. Did you think it was adequate? Does it answer your recommendations?
I can speak to that and then maybe let Anne add a little more detail, but our reaction to this particular response, and as I mentioned as well to the Deputy Minister, is I don't believe this is an adequate response. I think that it doesn't answer the questions that we asked, which is whether when we make a recommendation to government on internal controls, which is primarily what this is, we want to know from the department whether they agree or disagree with the recommendation, and if not, they can say why not. They're at liberty to disagree with us. If they agree, do they intend to implement or do they not intend to implement? And if not, again, why not? But if so, when and how? That's really what we want to know. And that's what we're looking for in terms of information to publish. And that allows us to follow up in 2 years to see whether that was implemented. These responses, quite often, we've read them several times, and it really is not possible to say in many cases whether you can answer those questions. And in fact, some of the responses obscure the issue. There were issues of accuracy. I think I might ask Anne to add something to that.
Ms. McDonald, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, as Jacques indicated, I guess from my perspective, there's two issues. The first issue, as Jacques noted, was the inability in a number of situations to determine whether or not there was agreement with the recommendation, let alone whether it was going to be implemented. I guess I also have a problem with the tone of several of them, not in terms of rudeness, but in terms of there's almost a questioning of the factual nature of the information that went into making the recommendation. And I'm disappointed because all this information is provided to the department well in advance, looking for input. Part of the management letter process for the financial audit, there are several departments who we might have issues that we want to discuss and that there are findings, and we provided information to the Department of Health, for example, and they corrected where needed the information we provided. Those issues were not terribly significant, so they didn't end up in this chapter. But that's what we're looking for. If there's an issue with what we're reporting, we want to know. We want what we report to be accurate, and we're more than happy to change details to reflect if we've made a mistake in how we interpreted something, more than happy to correct, to make an accurate presentation to the House on these matters. So disappointing from two aspects.
So in looking at these, and I believe there's 19 recommendations, a few of them that I just looked at did say that they were accepting them, but are there one or two in particular that you think are problematic, where you've made a solid recommendation, something that's a clear recommendation to government, and their answer is just unclear about whether they are going to accept it or agree with you, or just what their opinion is? I'd like to know, just so we can focus in on those recommendations that might be requiring more clarification when we get the opportunity.
Sure. For example, recommendation 2.5 as a specific, we can't tell whether or not the recommendation deals with an issue of completeness and accuracy of information that comes to us while we're performing the audit. And I certainly know that government accounting does goes through a process to determine these, it happens to be in this case, contractual obligations. But we've suggested that that more work be put into it with the departments to determine whether what departments are providing to government accounting and then ultimately to us is complete and accurate. And by the response here, we can't actually tell whether or not the department or the government accounting division is going to verify the accuracy and completeness of that information. Okay.
Is there another one that you'd like to point out as well, just, again, for our future reference?
Sure. There are a couple of recommendations, 2.10, 2.12, that deal with a project that deals with the issue of internal controls. And I'm quite at a loss to understand or to know whether or not the recommendations that we've noted, whether or not the response addresses what the recommendation is specifically dealing with. Okay. So it's hard to determine.
On your findings on internal controls, just to go to that one, and you had mentioned it in the presentation we received in the section in camera, you referenced weaknesses in internal controls and risk assessment. Could you talk a little bit about the controls that you found might be deficient, specific control deficiencies? That was one of your points in the presentation on page 3.
Sure. On page 25 of the report, we have some comments about some specific control activities, and they're detailed there under the headings of model-based revenue. So that mostly, well, it completely deals with tax revenues that are determined by models, debt amortization and deferred foreign exchange, system access and reconciliations. So, in each of those areas during the course of the audit, we found either in looking at controls specifically or in looking at transactions and imbalances that we found errors. And so we're backing that up and saying, okay, what's causing these errors? And is there a need, and we think there is, a need for some improvements in the controls that go around determining these revenues, for example, or the amortization, and in a review of the support for those transactions before they get posted to the general ledger to make sure that the information in the general ledger is complete and accurate.
Okay, so again, your answer to that would be greater I guess you'd be looking for greater accuracy from the department in the information they give to you, is that right? Primarily, and the information they report to the province?
In this particular case, we're looking for improvements in controls. We're looking for, I think, we're recommending a need to look at controls over how information is determined. In other words, the calculations, if necessary, prior to it being put into the GL, and just recommending that those controls be looked at. Are they adequate to improvements need to be made, and a go forward basis how they're monitored.
Well, you do refer to the volume of errors that you found, which should have indicated to government and Department of Finance that this is needed. As you say, you hadn't focused on the individual errors, you're focused on what caused them, and that means a need for greater control. Could you speak to the risk side as well? I note in our presentation earlier on, you talked about overall the level of risk needing to be assessed by every department, and then that way efforts can be placed where the risk is greatest. Some mitigating factors could come into play, or you'd be able to mitigate the risk?
Sure. One of the things we do as auditors, we are required by audit standards to look at the internal control environment. And one of the areas that we look at is whether or not there's been a risk assessment to financial reporting. You know, looking at various risks that might cause inaccuracies, assessing the risk, and maybe there wouldn't be any inaccuracy resulting from the risk at all, but I guess basically an identification of the risk and an assessment to see that controls are in place to mitigate the risk. So we mention this in here because it's part of our audit process. It's not that we are commenting on the need for these risk assessments for any reason other than, as part of the audit process, we need to find out whether or not risks to financial reporting have been assessed, whether or not, for example, control activities and monitoring activities are known by departments, and we ask for their feedback. And we found that risk assessments were not being prepared related to financial reporting specifically.
Okay. One more minute, Ms. Whalen.
Just one more minute. Could you just comment briefly, Ms. MacDonald or Mr. Lapointe, on the recommendations that have not been acted on? You have a new column called Do Not Intend to Implement, and there are about 8 items in there from 2005 onward to 2008 audits where the government has said they don't intend to implement. Could you perhaps just talk about the importance of those items? Thank you.
Yeah, and again, I'll ask Ms. McDonald to address
There's
that.
only a few minutes.
Yeah,
a minute.
quickly.
I guess the main recommendation that's not being, that will not be implemented is this recommendation related to revenue estimates. So we've made that recommendation in, I think, each year, maybe save one since 2006, and they appear in the government financial reporting chapter. So there's an indication that that recommendation will not be implemented. And because of that, there are some similar and related recommendations that talk about the preparation of information in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles, and basically all information coming from government, including the revenue estimates. But because the revenue estimates are not prepared on a consolidated basis, they've indicated that they don't intend to implement other related recommendations on full GAAP compliance.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I have to interrupt, and we move now to 15 minutes for the Conservative Caucus. Mr. McMaster.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question is on debt and GDP, or productivity and future prosperity of the province. I think debt can be a real problem, and I know you've stated that in your report. I know that some people disagree with that, but and I was listening to some of the comments of the honourable member from Halifax, Shabukdo, and there were a couple of points that I thought I would insert in there as well that have caused the economic crisis throughout the world. One was household debt, because the government in the United States, through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, was starting to give loans to people. They called them ninja loans, people who had no income, no jobs or assets. So the government was deciding to give people, encouraging people to load up on debt in their homes. There were also, of course, we had record low interest rates at the time, we still do. That was one of the reasons that caused the collapse. Of course, that's what caused the collapse inside the credit default swaps, was you had these toxic loans that were mixed in with probably good loans, and they had a good rating stamped on them by the rating agency. But as we all know, nobody wanted to own those loans because nobody could pay them back. So household debt was a problem. And I know that government debt is a problem now. If you look in Europe, we saw the countries, and they refer to them as the pigs: Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain, and Ireland. And those countries, as we know, when they joined the EU, had access to borrowing under the good terms of being included with countries like Germany, who had outstanding economic records and better status. Anyway, I'm going to get to my point, but I just wanted to put those 2 points on the record, that I do think that government debt and household debt do impact the prosperity of a province. If we bring it to this province, over the past couple of years, we've seen a loss of 6,500 jobs. We've seen higher taxes. We've seen higher power rates. They're obviously going to impact on our cost competitiveness. One of the components in your analysis is the debt to GDP ratio, and my question is this: despite the federal government providing our province with a contract for shipbuilding, which is really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity of $25 billion. Would you see that, like based on what you're seeing right here and what you're reporting today, do you see the productivity of our province relative to our debt, do you see that number declining or at best flat because of the conditions that we're in right now?
You're really asking me to comment on areas that really beyond my expertise, and in fact, well, beyond what we normally do. This is looking ahead and projecting what might happen in the province. And I'll admit, aside from my commentary on the philosophical issues around debt, the rest of our report is based on facts and things that we look at and things that we find, and that's where we need to keep it. So there's not really any way that I can answer that question.
Okay, I appreciate that. And I don't know really if there's any other way I can rephrase it to make it useful, other than that, I guess as we look at that figure, it's an important one, because would you say that as our debt grows, it does impact the ability of our productivity as a province and our positive trends in GDP direction for the province?
It have various effects on the economy over a long period of time. If it continues to grow, then it starts having impacts everywhere. But in the short term, it's really hard to say, because all the factors all relate together. So the concern I had that I was expressing was a very long-term issue, what happens far in the future as opposed to what happens right now or even in the next few years.
Okay. One of the other figures I was looking at in the financial indicators is the cost of debt in the province and the interest that we're paying each year. And I believe it's on page 60 of the report. Would you say that the trend seems to be that the cost has been going down a bit? Would you say that one of the factors in that is the interest rates and the fact that they are low now? And lower when I guess, I know when I was looking at, when I was reviewing the budget and looking at the debt, oftentimes it would be a $500,000 bond would mature and the province would go out to market at the new interest rate. And, so I guess I'll let you answer.
Yes, given that really we're without having done, a lot of analysis of what's behind these figures, we're presenting, the statistics and the trends just for information. The reduction of overall debt costs, I can see what two factors that stand out there. One, of course, low interest rate period, and two, a reduction of total debt over a period of time. And these might impact it, but I wouldn't be in a position, to say, well, definitively, here's why the interest rates or the interest costs have been decreasing over these particular years. You can see the trend. That's not to say I have no idea, if I'm looking at that, what will happen in the next few years. We can only say that this is what has happened in the past, and these are potentially, if you look at some of the other indicators, some of the ones that might feed into that.
Okay. I'm going to try to move to maybe more of a practical question that I think a lot of Nova Scotians would have in their minds. Last year, when we heard when the new budget was brought in for this year and a report on the previous year's budget, and I'm asking this because, of course, as the auditor, you look at the budgets, you look at how things are put together and whatnot. So we saw a projected deficit and then a glowing surplus pretty well the next day. Between the update on the previous year and then going into the new budget year. I think that causes people to question, well, what is in the numbers? And I know that's part of your job as the auditor, is to make sure that numbers are presented accurately and that they give a true picture so that over time we can compare past budgets to future budgets and make sure that we're holding the government accountable. I guess as opposition, that's my job, to make sure that we're trying to move the province in the right direction. Does the way that the budgets are put together now leave room for governments, for lack of a better term, to play with the numbers, to maybe distort the real image of what's going on? And, I think of a couple of examples. I know HST projections are way off. I know the minister said, well, that's because we have to wait to get the numbers from the federal government. But I mean, you could project HST based on consumer expenditure and a rate of inflation. And I also know that full-time equivalents, the number of people employed by government, oftentimes the numbers are budgeted for, but the actual people aren't hired. So it's almost allowing the government a pot of money to play with. So back to my question, does the way the budgets are put together now, does it leave room for governments to distort the numbers year to year?
Well, I need to clarify, I guess, that when it comes to the budget, we review the revenue side of the budget. And we do not look at the overall production of the budget or the expenditure side at all. And that's quite a different animal. We review the revenues precisely to ensure that within a reasonable level of assurance that the numbers in the revenue side are based on reasonable assumptions and that they can be relied on to a reasonable extent. And so I believe that would likely the original intent of having, this province have its auditor look at those numbers is to provide some assurance as to the reasonability of what you're looking at on the revenue side. But beyond that, it's definitely not part of our mandate to comment on the expense side or therefore on the whole. But we do give an opinion precisely, and this is the issue of our qualification. We give an opinion on the reasonableness of the revenue estimate so that, in fact, it can be relied on.
Okay, thank you. With respect to FTEs, has your office ever done an audit on the accuracy of those numbers, how they're reported back into the Department of Finance?
I would say within a recent memory, no.
Would that be something that you might consider doing in the future?
I'll take anything under advisement.
Okay,
but
thank you.
We haven't so.
Okay. My next question, I noticed something in your report about monthly SAP reports, or monthly reports using that data that's collected under the SAP system. Would they not be a good measure to keep numbers up to date and accurate throughout the year to help a government understand exactly where it is at any point in time, at least on a monthly basis?
Sure. Thank you. I think you're referring to the information that's on pages 28 and 29, dealing with the...
That's it.
Yes, preparation of budget forecast updates. And I guess what our thoughts are on this is that the general ledger supports the government's transactions, records the government's transactions. And we've found that in looking at how information is in the general ledger, we've noted there that there are some balances that are not recorded in the general ledger during the course of the year. That's not to say that there's not an awareness by government of what these revenues, it's mostly revenues, are. There is a forecasting process. But it's our thought that a good financial management practice is that the general ledger support the forecasts so that these items should be recorded on a regular basis throughout the course of the year.
Okay. I mean, I think the accuracy of the numbers is so important for everybody involved, whether it's the government or the opposition or, of course, the auditors, because the more accurate the numbers are, the less incidents you have of people complaining that, oh, we've come into government and, the numbers aren't the way we expected at all. If the numbers are accurate, there shouldn't be any big surprises, should there? Based on the information technology we have now, if the information is being collected properly and presented properly, there shouldn't really be big surprises, should there? I mean, I know there's incidences where, say, I'll give you an example, royalties, offshore royalties may decline, but I mean, even something like that, we often hear that, exploration activity has declined. I'll let you answer the question. I think I've given you enough perspective to answer.
Ms. McDonald.
Thank you. What we're talking about in pages 28 and 29 is basically the general ledger needs to be updated. We're not saying that the information in the forecasts as they're produced throughout the course of the year, I believe there are 4 times that a forecast is presented, that we're commenting on the accuracy of the forecasted information. We don't do work on the forecast during the course of the year. So it really is a financial management issue. It's that a general ledger should support the forecast and should be up to date. So it's more of an accounting records issue, if you will, as opposed to commentary on the accuracy of the forecasts.
Right, right. But it should make the accuracy of the forecast better if everything is lining up, shouldn't it?
I don't necessarily think that one depends on the other. The forecast is based on economic assumptions at the time and information, et cetera. But certainly what is produced by the forecast should be reflected in the general ledger.
Sure, sure. And I know that makes sense. I guess when I've actually done my own projections on the provincial budget, and I often use the historical record, whatever the trend is, if there's something happening in it. In fact, my numbers have sometimes, and I'll give you one example that I noticed it was a bit of an anomaly, and there was a number of them. One was in tobacco revenues. I think it was the year before last, they were down 13%, and I was projecting them to be maybe down 1%, because if the incidence of smoking in the province is going down, you know, we should see a gradual decline, but it was down by 13%. The next year it was back up by 14%, which was basically flat, which is kind of what I was projecting. So I guess the reason I'm probing is just to get a better understanding of the systems that are in place to make sure that they're working, because sometimes we do see anomalies and they raise questions for people. But I'll move to my, I think I have time for one last question.
You have about 45 seconds.
I'll make it quick. On page 10 of the short the summary document, it says that it recommends the government provide projections of the sources and uses of resources over a longer term and provide commentary on the main risks impacting these projections. And that has to do with future sustainability of government. Could you offer some quick comments on what that might look like?
Yes.
Mr. Lapointe.
We're making suggestions here on you know, additional information that might be useful for government to provide, which would be take things which are in effect suggested by the Public Sector Accounting Board, and these would add to longer term projections of sustainability. It's really up to, we're not making recommendations in this respect. We're just suggesting that this is new information that's coming out, and guidance has been provided as a possible useful information. So the government should, or the department should consider, take a look at this and see if there's anything useful that could be added to the financial information of government.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lapointe. And we will turn the floor over again to the NDP Caucus. Mr. Epstein for 15 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Lapointe, I only have a few more items that I want to go through with you. When we left off a few minutes ago, we were discussing the issue of global interest rates, and I was interrupted, I think, in the point that I was making, so I want to just be completely clear. I'm looking at page 2 of your summary document, and there you say that government becomes vulnerable to swings in national and global interest rates. Now, the problem I have with this statement is not that it is inaccurate as a general commentary. Of course, everyone is potentially vulnerable. The question really, though, is whether the public is going to be scared when they find the Auditor General using words like vulnerable. And the question that I have to ask myself is whether this is anything like an accurate description of just how exposed we are in Canada, in our province, to swings, as you say, in national and global interest rates. And what I want to suggest to you is not just that interest rates are now very low, but they're in fact likely to stay low for quite some time. There is absolutely no indication that interest rates are really going up, or if they are going to go up, will go up very much at all. And I was pointing out to you that where they have gone up, which is in a number of the European countries that have been regarded as being in danger of sovereign debt default, that is on essentially going bankrupt and being unable to pay their bondholders, they're the ones who have had to pay higher interest interest rates in order to get people to take their bonds. That means Portugal, it's meant Greece, and to a certain extent, a little bit Italy. But it doesn't mean anyone in Canada. I think if you've had a chance to see it, the other day, the Globe and Mail had a very good survey of the credit ratings for Canada and for nations around the world. Canada is in a position of AAA when it comes to solidity of its ratings by bond-holding agencies and by rating agencies and by bondholders. And what this means is that Canada is one of about 12 nations in the world where it is particularly attractive to place money if one wishes to be safe. If bondholders are looking for returns that are safe, Canada is the place to be. And that is well worth emphasizing. And I didn't see it emphasized anywhere here. It's furthermore the case that given the instability in many other places, like many countries in Europe, entities that wish to put money into bonds will be rushing to put their money in Canada. That will mean that entities, subnational entities like provinces and our federal government will be able to offer their bonds at paying interest rates that are less than they might otherwise have to offer, because there will be a rush of currency into Canada looking to buy those bonds. That's what the analysis is at the moment, and I see no reason to differ from that myself. I think that that is well worth remembering, and I see no exploration of this. Instead, I see language that is highly problematic, because without any kind of suggestion that there is another dimension to the problem or any suggestion as to what the timetable might be on how so-called vulnerable we are to these so-called swings, then we're left really with an abstract statement that one could not disagree with, but is not helpful. So that's the problem I have with that, and I now want to move on to a couple of other points. The next item that occurs to me, of course, is the problem, another way of thinking about this question of debt. You've identified for us that you think debt is problematic. You've gone so far as to suggest that there's an element of immorality or unethicalness about it. But the question is, I don't see what it is that you're suggesting to us, if anything, that we do about it. That's not something that really comes out of your document. There's no suggestion of what we do about it beyond what we're already doing, which is being on track to stopping putting down the shovel since we find ourselves in a hole. We're stopping digging. We're moving towards back to balance. I mean, I don't see that there's a suggestion, because there are other ways to deal with debt. One is you can raise taxes, but I don't see you advocating for that. I don't see you discussing it. It doesn't come in to the report. It's not there. I also don't see you, for example, identifying that one of the main ways in which governments have managed to get debt where even where it has been problematic under control is through growing the economy. The historical example in Canada that is frequently cited in articles and textbooks is the position of Canada after World War II. The federal government took on enormous debt in order to finance the war effort during World War II. I'm sure you're aware of this because you mentioned in passing the problem of the justification of borrowing in times of emergencies and wars. Well, that's what the federal government did. But you know what? The main way in which the federal government came to grips with that national debt was by growing the economy through growth in the economy after World War II. It's not that the debt was paid down. It's what happened is that the Canadian economy grew enormously in those post-war years, and so the ability of the economy to carry the debt that had been accumulated in wartime became much more manageable. Well, the same thing applies to a subnational government, to a provincial government. We can look at it and say our economy is growing, and then the ability to carry debt becomes less serious of a problem. Well, if you're going to talk debt at all, you have to talk about this particular point. You have to talk about what the prospects are for the growth in the economy. You have to talk about it, as you keep saying, long term. You have to if it's a long-term problem that you're talking about, then you have to look long term. And I agree, we have something of a stagnant population here, and but nonetheless, there has been growth every year in some aspects of our provincial economy in terms of the gross domestic product, and so the situation, although difficult, is not impossible. But again, I don't see a discussion of this, and we're left with the impression that this is an overwhelming problem to the exclusion of other policy initiatives that could be taken. Finally, what I don't see highlighted in your initial approach to this question is the idea of where we stand in comparison to the federal government and the other provincial entities. Now, when I turn to the actual details of the report, there are tables in which this actually appears, in which the information about the indicators of the financial condition of the province can actually be pulled out on a comparative basis. But somehow the good news that is there, it doesn't find its way into the general discussion that you offer us at the beginning. And so this is what I have to remind you and remind our observers and listeners is what you actually say. So here's your table 4.11. Net debt as a percentage of total provincial revenues. And as you point out, over the past 5 years, this ratio has fluctuated in Nova Scotia from a high of 149% in 2007 to 129.6% in 2011. Well, the point is, the trend is down. Point is that that number is less than it was before. And you give us comparators to other provinces. And when we look at the other provinces, when we look at the actual table that you lay out for us, when you compare Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, PEI, and then Saskatchewan and Manitoba, we find that when we look at that in terms of where Nova Scotia is, we're doing perfectly well with respect to New Brunswick and PEI, and really not far off where Manitoba is, despite its advantageous position. It's Saskatchewan and Newfoundland, as was pointed out elsewhere, that have very good natural resource bases where they've managed to do better, but our comparative position is not bad. Then your table 4.12, net debt as a percentage of provincial GDP. Well, you point out that the overall trend has been a declining ratio from 39.1% in 2007 to 35.7% in 2011. Again, an improvement in the position, and that ties into, I think, partly growth in the provincial economy. Debt servicing costs is another one of your tables as a percentage of total revenue, table 4.16. In Nova Scotia, this ratio has decreased from a high of 11.6% in 2007 to a low of 8.7% in 2011. Again, what we see is a decline in the number, and when we look at the comparative provinces, and I would add, we should probably also look at all the provinces and the federal government, we're doing quite well. And my recollection is that, in fact, when it comes to debt servicing costs as a percentage of total revenue, we're doing much better than the federal government. Then you, in table 4.17, turn to accumulated surpluses and deficits as a percentage of provincial gross domestic product. And again, you say the ratio for Nova Scotia declined from 27.2% in 2007 to 21.9% in 2011. So I this is yet another reason why I find that I have problems with what it is that you have offered to us as commentary about the position of Nova Scotia vis-a-vis debt. Debt is only one of a number of issues that are being grappled with. Other concerns, of course, have to do with our need for infrastructure, the need for stimulus, the need to grow the economy, the need to have taxing levels at taxes at a level that people can afford, and the need to deliver general services that people actually need. But the real picture is that in fact we're moving towards the situation in which we are going to stop accumulating debt. That's the objective. That's the path that the government has been on. It's the plan that has been adopted as back to balance. So my plea to you, Mr. Lapointe, is that if we are going to see future analysis from your office that makes commentary on the general economic position of the province that goes beyond what is the traditional auditing function, then I think it has to be done in a slightly different way. And I'm asking you to think, please, very carefully about what else might have happened in this document and what could happen in future documents. It's not that it's wrong entirely for you to think about the problem of sustainability of the economy. I think that is in some sense fair ball, but to pick out one aspect, the debt aspect, and then to give what I have to say is a fairly narrow and unamplified explanation of the problem serves none of us in the legislature very well, and doesn't serve the public well, because it tends to frighten the public into thinking that Nova Scotia is in a much worse financial position than we are. So with that, I again repeat my invitation and my plea to you to take these comments in what are intended to be both critical but also constructive fashion. I hope that what we'll see if you decide to embark on this again is something that will be more fleshed out, more detailed, and I have to say more balanced. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Epstein. Your timing was good. You're finished your 15 minutes. I'd like to turn the floor over to Mr. Lapointe for any closing comments that you would have for today on your report.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. In closing, I'd simply like to thank the committee for this opportunity to discuss our report on government's financial operations. And while I can understand that some members may not appreciate all the things we're trying to say in the report or the general approach, that I trust the committee and the House will find these reports and this approach to reporting on our financial management issues to be informative in future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lapointe. There are just a few items of business today for the committee, if we could just turn our attention to that. Everybody will receive information that was given back from the December 14th meeting. It's on diabetes care, and there are some pamphlets there that are going to be given to every member of the House so that they can be circulated. They have to do with home dialysis. So that's in front of us today. We also have a updated list of our record of decisions, which is the upcoming meetings. These have all been agreed to by the subcommittee and by the committee here. We have no meetings for the next 2 weeks, so that's one thing I want to point out because of caucus meetings out of town. Our next meeting is back here on February 8th, and it is intended to be a session where we are learning more about the public accounts, the sort of nuts and bolts of it. It isn't intended to be a session where we will be discussing the Auditor General's report, and it is worth noting that the Auditor General will not be there because of a conference that day, so I'm hoping that the questions related to this report will hold off till February 29th, when we confirm that members from the Finance Department will be in to discuss this report of the Auditor General. So I think that covers all of the business before us today. And with that, I will ask for a motion to adjourn. Thank you.